March of 1993, the last week of it when the wind off the Flint Hills still carried cold in the morning, but the grass was beginning to push through the dead thatch along the fence lines. A man named Walt Decker drove his truck down Route 99 and pulled onto the gravel shoulder in front of a gate he had driven past 100 times and never stopped at. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine idling. On the seat beside him was a copy of the Journal of Animal Science folded open to page 41. He had read the page 3 times that morning. He had read it the night before, sitting in his living room after his son Harlan had brought it to him, without saying much, just setting it on the arm of the chair and walking out of the room. Walt had read it twice before he understood what he was reading. He had sat in that chair for a long time after that, not reading anything, just looking at the wall. Now he was sitting in his truck in front of Ruth Calloway's gate, and the engine was idling and he was not getting out yet. The journal was on the seat. He did not look at it again. He already knew what it said. This is a story about what Ruth Calloway did in the 12 years between 1981 and that morning in 1993, when Walt Decker sat in his truck outside her gate. It is a story about a woman who bought something nobody wanted and spent 12 years proving that the thing everybody laughed at was the most valuable animal in the county. But to understand what Ruth did, you have to understand what she lost first. And to understand what she lost, you have to go back to a Tuesday afternoon in November of 1976, in a pickup truck parked on a dirt track along the back 40 of the Calloway place, with the engine off and the door closed, and Earl Calloway sitting in the driver's seat with his hands in his lap and his eyes open and looking at nothing at all. Ruth found him at 4:30. She had been checking the south pasture water line, and she came around the stand of cottonwoods near the creek and saw the truck parked at the wrong angle on the track. Not pulled off to the side the way Earl always pulled off when he was stopping to look at something, but sitting at a slight diagonal like it had just rolled to a stop on its own. She knew before she got to the window. She knew the way you know certain things, not from any signal or evidence, but from some part of your body that registers the absence of something before your mind catches up to it. She stood outside the truck door for a moment with her hand on the handle. Then she opened it. Earl Calloway was 51 years old. He had been checking fence line. He had a pair of fencing pliers in the pocket of his barn coat and a half-eaten ham sandwich on the seat beside him. The coroner said it was his heart. It was over in less than a minute. He had not suffered. Ruth stood next to the truck in the November cold for a long time. Then she went back to the house and made the call she needed to make. They had been married 22 years. He had taught her to drive a tractor before he taught her to drive a car. He had shown her how to read a cow the way a mechanic reads an engine, not by looking at the obvious parts, but by looking at the places most people walk past. The pin bones, the tailhead, the brisket, the way an animal carries her weight when she has condition versus when she is burning it off. He had shown her how to read a balance sheet and how to read a pasture and how to read the sky in July when the clouds were building over the western horizon. He had taught her everything he knew about 160 acres of mixed grass and hay ground in Pottawatomie County, Kansas. And then he had died on a Tuesday afternoon with fencing pliers in his pocket. And Ruth had been running the place alone ever since. 5 years by the time the Westmoreland auction came around in March of 1981. 5 years of mornings that started before light and ended after dark, and every decision landing on one set of shoulders. She ran 28 head of commercial Hereford cows cut and baled her own hay with a 1968 New Holland 268 baler and a Ford 3000 tractor that Earl had bought new and that Ruth serviced every spring and started on the 1st of every month. The way Earl had done, not because it needed it, but because that was what you did with a machine that had served you right. She maintained her own fences. She kept the books in a spiral notebook she carried in the pocket of her barn coat, the same coat she had worn since before Earl died, with the same kind of pencil in the left breast pocket, and the same habit of writing down numbers the moment she measured them, rather than trusting herself to remember. The men at the Westmoreland livestock auction knew her. She was there most months. They respected her the way that rural men of a certain era respected a woman who kept a place running, which is to say they acknowledged it privately and never quite said so out loud. And most of them would have been surprised to learn they were doing either. Her neighbor, Roy Stanton, had stopped underestimating her sometime around the summer of 1978, when she rebuilt the water system on the south pasture by herself, using parts from a plumbing supply in Manhattan, Kansas, and a diagram she had drawn on the back of a feed receipt. Roy had watched her dig the trench in July heat and offered to help exactly once. She had declined politely. He had not offered again, not because she had offended him, but because he recognized the quality of a person who needed to prove something to themselves before they could accept help from anyone. He respected that. From that summer on, when Ruth needed something, Roy provided it without commentary or condition. The operation was sound, but it had problems. 3 of them, and they had been getting worse for several years, and Ruth had been thinking about all 3 of them for a long time before she found any way toward a solution. The first problem was heat. Pottawatomie County summers pushed past 100 degrees on a regular basis, sometimes holding there for 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. Her Hereford cows bred for English conditions, where the temperature rarely climbed past 70, spent the hottest weeks of the year standing in whatever shade they could find. Losing weight, cycling late, occasionally developing pink eye and sunburn on their white faces, because the white pigmentation that was part of the Hereford breed standard offered no protection from a Kansas summer sun. She lost 1 cow every 2 or 3 years to heat-related complications. The ones she did not lose simply stopped performing during the hottest 60 days of the year. 60 days of feed costs producing nothing. She had priced out Mr. Shade Structure's rotational systems that kept animals near water during peak heat hours. None of it solved the problem. It managed it at a cost. The second problem was the fescue. Her north pasture, 60 acres of it, was dominated by endophyte-infected tall fescue. The endophyte was a fungus that lived inside the grass and produced a toxin that caused vasoconstriction in cattle, meaning it reduced blood flow to the extremities. In summer, that meant heat stress on top of the heat stress they were already experiencing. In winter, it meant fescue foot, a condition that caused reduced circulation in the lower legs, and in severe cases caused hooves and tail tips to slough off. Most ranchers either avoided fescue pastures entirely, accepted the production loss, or spent money reseeding with novel endophyte varieties at around $300 an acre. Ruth had priced the reseeding option in 1978. 60 acres at $300 per acre was $18,000. Her gross cattle income in a good year was $15,000. She had closed that notebook and moved on. The third problem was the calves. The county average weaning weight had climbed steadily through the 1970s as genetics improved across the region, but her herd was plateauing. She was weaning at 420 pounds on average. The top herds in Pottawatomie County were weaning at 500 or better. The difference was $80 per calf at current prices. 28 calves times $80 was $2,240 a year she was not making. She could see the number in her ledger every October. She could see it getting worse as other operations upgraded their genetics, and hers held still. She was running the same Hereford bull lines she had been using since Earl's time. They were good bulls from a solid operation. But good was no longer holding its ground against the improving county average. 3 problems, 1 operation, 1 set of hands to fix all of it. In September of 1979, Ruth read an article in Beef Today magazine about a breed of cattle called Thule, originally developed in what was then Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe by the Thule people over several centuries. The breed had been selected across generations for heat tolerance, resistance to parasites, docility, and the ability to maintain body condition on poor forage. The article mentioned that a small number of Thule genetics had entered the United States through embryo imports, and that researchers at several land-grant universities were beginning to study the potential of Thule crosses with British breeds for operations in the Southern Plains states. The article was 4 pages long and included a sidebar about a preliminary trial at Oklahoma State University under a professor of animal science named Dr. Raymond Polk. Ruth did not read the article casually. She read it the way she read everything that connected to problems she was already working on, slowly twice through with a pencil in her hand, underlining the passages that mattered. She underlined 3 things. She underlined the passage about heat tolerance and coat type. She underlined the passage about vascular adaptation and fescue toxicosis, because she had not known until that moment that there was a genetic dimension to fescue resistance, that tropical breeds carried natural vascular adaptation that allowed blood to continue flowing to the skin, even when the endophyte toxin was trying to constrict it. And she underlined the sentence that said, Thule crosses with British breeds showed heterosis effects that pushed weaning weights 10 to 15% above either parent breed. 1 breed, 3 problems. She read the article a 3rd time. Then she tore it out of the magazine, folded it twice, and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept important papers. The same drawer that held Earl's death certificate and the deed to the property and the loan papers from the bank. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Dr. Raymond Polk at Oklahoma State University. She wrote 2 pages. She described her operation, the acreage, the stocking rate, the forage types, the annual rainfall, the 3 problems she was trying to solve. She asked specific questions about the Thule cross trials, about fescue tolerance in practice versus in theory, about what a small operator in Kansas would need to do to get access to the genetics being studied. She did not apologize for writing. She did not explain who she was beyond what was relevant. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, addressed it to Dr. Polk at the Animal Science Department, and mailed it on a Thursday. He wrote back in 2 weeks. She had not expected a response at all, let alone one that came quickly. What she had expected, if anything arrived, was a form letter or a pamphlet. What she received was 3 pages of handwriting in a precise small script that covered the paper front and back and answered every question she had asked with specificity and without condescension. He asked her detailed questions in return. How many acres of fescue? What the endophyte infection rate had been measured at if she knew. What her current conception rate was during July and August versus the spring. He asked whether she had any way to measure individual animal performance in her current herd, and when she wrote back that she kept daily records in a spiral notebook going back 7 years. He had underlined that sentence in her letter and written 2 words in the margin. She could tell this because he mentioned it in his next reply. He had written that matters. They wrote back and forth through the winter of 1979 and all of 1980. His letters became longer. Hers became more specific. He sent her photocopied data sheets from his crossbreeding trials. She sent him her weaning weight records from the previous 3 years with her own notes in the margins. By the spring of 1980, she had a folder on the shelf above her desk that contained 11 letters and 40-some pages of research data, and she had a clear picture in her mind of what she was looking for and why. She knew she could not buy registered Thule genetics. The few breeders working with the breed were in Texas and Oklahoma, and they were not selling to small operators in Kansas at any price she could reach. What she needed was a cow with demonstrable tropical influence. A cow that had already proven she could handle temperate conditions. A cow with the coat and the frame and the temperament that the research described. She needed to find her at an auction where nobody else knew what they were looking at. And then she needed to be patient enough to let the data speak before anyone else started paying attention. That was the plan. She had been working on it for 2 years before the Westmoreland auction of March 1981. 3 days before the auction, Ruth drove 40 miles to a property near Junction City. The property had belonged to a man named Colonel James Ware, a retired Army veterinarian who had spent 20 years overseas in Kenya, Rhodesia, South Africa, and 3 years on agricultural advisory work in Botswana, and who had come home to Kansas and kept a small collection of breeds he had encountered during his service. Colonel Ware had died in January of a stroke at his kitchen table. His daughter Sandra, who lived in Overland Park and managed the estate with the focused efficiency of someone trying to close a chapter they had no sentimental attachment to, had consented to let Ruth visit the animals on the property before the consignment. She had said to Ruth on the phone, in a voice that was not unkind but was clearly busy, "The key is under the mat." Ruth drove out on a Wednesday morning. The property smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather even from the outside. She walked among 7 animals in a muddy lot behind the farmhouse. 6 of them were various tropical crosses of uncertain value, thin in the winter coat, nervous not what she was looking for. The 7th was different. She was small, maybe 900 pounds, in a county where a respectable cow weighed 1,100. Her color was a dusty reddish-brown, with a white face marking that matched no breed the local men ran. Her horns curved forward instead of out. Her coat was slick and tight, in a way that the other ranchers in the county would read as thin. But Ruth had read enough of Dr. Polk's data sheets to know was not thinness at all. It was the coat of an animal built over centuries to shed heat in climates where a thick winter hide would kill faster than any predator. She stood quietly at the fence while the other animals moved and shifted. She watched Ruth with an expression that could only be described as patient. Ruth stood at that fence for 20 minutes. She looked at the cow's feet, which were black and hard and shaped exactly right. She looked at the udder, tight and well attached with small teats that a calf could nurse without difficulty. She looked at the body condition score and calculated it against the quality of the forage in the lot, which was poor, and came to a conclusion she would carry with her for the next 15 years. Then she went inside to see if Colonel Ware had left any records. He had. In a small room off the kitchen that he had used as an office, she found a wooden crate on the bottom shelf of a bookcase. Inside the crate were journals, 10 of them, at least. Leather-covered notebooks of varying sizes, filled with handwriting in blue ink. She pulled the most recent one. It was dated from 1971 through 1978. She stood in the dead man's office in the quiet house and read for 40 minutes. Colonel Ware had been meticulous. 20 years of observations across 4 countries. Breeding dates, calving notes, conditions, scores, performance measurements, and written passages that read like a man thinking out loud about what he was seeing and why it mattered. The cow in the lot was documented in the last 20 pages. Her dam was full, Thule imported through a Texas breeder in 1973. Her sire was Senapole, another heat-adapted tropical breed. She was the 3rd generation born on American soil. At the back of the journal, folded and slid between the back cover, and the last page was a white envelope. Ruth almost put it back. Then she looked at the address. It was addressed to the Pottawatomie County Extension Office. It was sealed and stamped and had never been mailed. She turned it over. On the back, in Colonel Ware's handwriting, were 2 dates. The first was October 1979. The second was March 1980. She held it for a moment. Then she opened it. It was a 2-page letter. Colonel Ware had written to the county extension office in October of 1979 to offer what he called a practical demonstration of heat-adapted breed performance in a temperate Kansas setting. He proposed hosting a field day at his property, sharing his records and his animals with any producers in the area who might be interested in exploring alternatives to conventional British breeds for high-stress environments, specifically for fescue-dominated pastures and operations that suffered significant production loss during summer heat. The letter was specific, well-reasoned, and generous. It asked for nothing except a willing audience. Clipped to the letter was a smaller envelope. Ruth opened it too. Inside was a single card with the seal of the Kansas State University Extension Service at the top. The response was 3 sentences. It stated that the Extension Office appreciated Colonel Ware's interest, but that the office's current focus was on established breed programs, and that the information he described was not within the scope of their current educational priorities. The signature at the bottom was Glenn Hadley County Extension Agent, Pottawatomie County. October 1979 was the same month Ruth had written her first letter to Dr. Polk. She stood in Colonel Ware's office holding both pieces of paper for a long time. Then she folded the original letter and the Extension Office response back into the envelope, put the envelope in the inside pocket of her barn coat, and picked up the journal. She carried both out to the truck. She drove back to her place and fed cattle and checked water, and did not say anything about what she had found to anyone, because there was no one at the kitchen table to say anything to, and because what she had found was not something that needed to be said out loud yet. It needed to be used. There was a difference. The Westmoreland livestock auction on the 3rd Saturday of March ran about 140 head that morning. The yard smelled the way it always smelled manure diesel, and the particular sweat of men who had been standing in the sun since 6 in the morning evaluating animals they had no intention of buying. The good lots went early. The average lots filled the middle. The culls and the odd consignments and the animals that did not fit any category the buyers recognized went last, when half the crowd had already walked to their trucks, and the auctioneer was thinking about what came after noon. Lot 87 was third from last. She stood in a holding pen near the back gate, away from the main run, because the yard manager had not known where else to put her. The men leaning on the rail had opinions that ranged from dismissive to confused. She was small. Her color was wrong. Her horns curved the wrong direction. Her coat looked thin to a man who did not know what he was looking at. She stood quietly in the pen while the other consignment animals paced and called. She did not pace. She watched the men watching her with the same patient expression she had offered Ruth 3 days earlier at the fence in Junction City. The auctioneer read the consignment card without enthusiasm. Crossbred cow approximately 6 years old, no registration papers, open sound. He did not mention the breed because the card said mixed, because Sandra had written that word in the breed line and moved on. He opened at 180. Nobody moved. He dropped to 150. A feedlot buyer in the second row raised his hand, not because he wanted her, but because at 150 she was worth her slaughter weight barely. The auctioneer looked for 160. Nothing. He looked for 155. Nothing. He was about to drop the hammer when a voice from the back of the yard said 200. The men near the rail turned around. Most of them knew who it was before they looked. The feedlot buyer considered briefly, then shrugged and let it go. 200 was not a number worth arguing over for an animal nobody understood. The hammer came down. Ruth Calloway had just bought something that every cattleman at Westmoreland that morning considered at best a waste of feed. Walt Decker heard about it that afternoon. Walt ran 600 head of registered Black Angus on a place 12 miles north of Westmoreland, and considered himself the primary authority on beef genetics in Pottawatomie County. He had not been at the auction that day. But he heard about Lot 87 by Saturday evening, and by the following Tuesday, it had come up twice at the feed store on the west side of Westmoreland, which served the same social function in that community that such establishments have always served in agricultural counties across the American plains. A place where information about your neighbors passed through without needing anyone to formally introduce it. Walt said what he said at the feed store without saying what he was actually saying, which is the particular skill of a man who has spent a lifetime in a community small enough that direct statements carry consequences. He said the kind of thing that happens when somebody reads too many magazines and doesn't have anyone around to talk sense. The men around him did not disagree. None of them had seen the cow. None of them needed to. The consensus was already formed. Glenn Hadley, the county extension agent, heard about it too. He stopped by Ruth's place the following week under the cover of checking on her hay inventory, which was a service he provided to several operations in the county, and which required no particular explanation. He walked out to the pasture and looked at the new cow for a few minutes. He said she was an unusual-looking animal. Ruth agreed that she was. He waited for her to say more about it. She did not. He asked where she had come from. Ruth said an estate liquidation out of Junction City. He nodded. He drove back to his office and filed nothing about it because there was nothing to file, and because nothing in his conversation with Ruth Calloway that morning had given him any information he could use, which was precisely what Ruth had intended. Roy Stanton had helped without being asked. He had lent the stock trailer without asking where it was going or what was coming back in it. When Ruth pulled the trailer back into the driveway at the Stanton place that Saturday afternoon and unhooked it, Roy came out of the barn and saw the cow through the trailer slats and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he supposed she would let him know if she needed anything. Ruth said she would. He went back into the barn. That was the entire conversation. She loaded Lot 87 into the trailer and drove 11 miles south on Route 99. She backed up to the pasture gate and let the cow walk out into 40 acres of native bluestem that Earl had never overgrazed, and that Ruth had managed since his death with the same careful rotation he had taught her. The cow walked 30 yards into the grass, dropped her head, and started grazing as though she had been doing it her whole life. She probably had. Ruth stood at the gate for a long time and watched her. The late afternoon sun was low over the western tree line, and the grass was coming in green at the base, and the cow's slick reddish coat caught the light in a way that made her look for a moment like something out of a different world, that had decided to visit this one and found the conditions acceptable. Ruth drove back to the house. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with her spiral notebook open and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she wrote the number 200 and underlined it. Then she wrote the words, "Purchase Lot 87 Westmoreland." And below that she began to record what she knew from the Colonel's journal about the cow's background. Her dam, her sire, her birth date, her condition history. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she had 2 full pages in her notebook and a folder on the shelf with 2 years of letters from Oklahoma State and a dead man's journal, and an envelope with a 3-sentence rejection from the county extension office inside it. She closed the notebook and washed her coffee cup and went out to do the evening feeding. March became April. April became May. The cow grazed the bluestem and settled into the herd, the way an animal settles in when she has no reason to be unsettled. Ruth watched her carefully through the spring. She watched how she moved in heat, whether she sought shade, how she carried condition on the same forage the Herefords were eating. What she observed, she wrote in the notebook every morning. The cow cycled in June on schedule, and Ruth bred her to her best Hereford bull on the same service date she had calculated from the Colonel's notes. The cow settled on first service. Ruth made a small check mark next to the date in her notebook. That was all. No one in the county knew about the breeding. No one had asked. Walt Decker had moved on to other subjects. Glenn Hadley had not come back. The feed store conversation had dried up the way such conversations always do when there is nothing new to feed them. Ruth was not in a hurry. Winter came hard that year. December brought a week below zero and 2 significant snowfalls, and the kind of northwest wind that comes off the open plains without anything to slow it down for 300 miles. The Hereford cows pulled through it the way they always did, which was adequately with some weight loss and some increased feed costs, and 1 case of respiratory illness that Ruth treated herself. The Tule Cross cow lost no visible condition. She stood in the open on mornings when the other cows were bunched at the windbreak and ate her hay without apparent discomfort. Ruth noted this in the notebook without comment. It was a data point. It was 1 winter. She was not drawing conclusions yet. January of 1982. February. The cow was showing. Ruth checked her twice a day through the 2nd week of February and moved her to the small calving pasture near the barn on the 15th. She had calculated the due date from the breeding records. She had noted in the Colonel's journal that Tule cows typically calved with minimal assistance, even in adverse conditions. She was awake and checking every 2 hours regardless. At 2 in the morning on a night in early March when the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees and the wind was pushing snow sideways across the calving pasture, Ruth walked out of the house in her barn coat with a flashlight and found the cow in the corner of the pasture by the old wooden gate standing over a small shape on the ground. She crossed the pasture in the dark and knelt down in the snow next to the calf. It was a heifer, reddish-brown like the mother with a white blaze on her face. She was already trying to stand. Ruth checked her breathing, cleared the airway, rubbed her down with a towel she had brought from the barn. By 3 in the morning, the calf was standing. By 4, she was nursing. At 5, Ruth came back out and found them both in the corner of the pasture, the calf tucked against the cow's flank, dry, steady, and alive. She went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with her notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the time of birth. She wrote the calf's sex and her markings and an estimate of her birth weight, which Ruth put at 62 pounds. Below that, she wrote a single notation: unassisted 19 degrees northwest wind. That was March of 1982. May came. Ruth weighed the calf on the portable scale she used for calf weights every year, the same scale she had used since Earl bought it. She got a number she did not trust. She moved the scale to level ground and recalibrated it and weighed the calf again. The number was the same. She drove the scale to Roy Stanton's place and weighed one of Roy's calves on it, and then weighed it on Roy's scale and compared the numbers. The calibration was correct. She drove back home and weighed the calf a 3rd time. The number was the same all 3 times. She walked back to the house slowly. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the number she had written in pencil on the palm of her hand, because she had not wanted to trust it to memory. Then she sat down at the table and opened the notebook to the April weaning projections she had written out based on the mother's milk production and the blue stem grass coming in on the north pasture. The number in her hand was not what the projections had predicted. It was significantly above what the projections had predicted. She looked at the number for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the blue stem was fully green now, and the Tule Cross heifer calf was in the pasture, with her mother not seeking shade, not bunching near the water, just moving steadily through the grass in the May morning light, as though the whole pasture belonged to her, and she intended to use all of it. Ruth closed the notebook. She did not call anyone. She did not write to Dr. Polk that evening. She did not say anything to Roy Stanton when she saw him at the grain elevator on Friday. She put the notebook back in the pocket of her barn coat and went out to feed cattle, and she kept what she knew to herself, because she had learned something 20 years ago, when she married a man who kept careful numbers and never shared them. until they meant something certain. 2 data points are a coincidence. The third one is evidence. She was going to wait for the third one. The second data point came in October of 1982. Ruth weaned her 28 Hereford calves on the same week she weaned the Tule Cross heifer, the way she had always done it, pulling the calves off their mothers over 2 days in early October, when the grass was still holding, and the weather had cooled enough to make the transition easier on everyone. She weighed each calf on the portable scale and wrote the number in her notebook next to the calf's ear tag. The Hereford calves averaged 424 pounds. That was close to what she had expected. It was close to what she had been averaging for several years, and close to what most of the other operations in the county were producing from similar genetics on similar ground. The Tule Cross heifer weighed 538 pounds. She was 7 months old. She had never had creep feed. She had never had a supplement of any kind beyond what the blue stem pasture provided, and what her mother gave her. She had grown on the same grass under the same management through the same summer heat that had pushed Ruth's Hereford cows into the shade for 6 weeks in July and August, while the Hereford calves spent those weeks nursing less and gaining less because their mothers were standing in whatever thin strip of shadow fell along the fence line at midday. The Tule Cross heifer had kept moving. Ruth had watched her through the summer. The calf grazed in full sun at noon when the temperature was over 100 degrees, the same way her mother did without apparent discomfort, without seeking shade, just moving steadily through the grass with her head down and her slick coat doing exactly what the Colonel's records and Dr. Polk's data sheets said it would do, which was to reflect heat rather than absorb it. 114 pounds above the herd average, on the same grass, with the same management. Ruth wrote the number in her notebook and circled it once with her pencil. She did not underline it. She did not write anything else next to it. She just circled it and closed the notebook and put it back in her barn coat pocket and went to move water. She kept the heifer. The third data point arrived in October of 1983, and the fourth in October of 1984, and by then Ruth had 6 pages of numbers in her notebook that told a story she was not yet willing to tell anyone else, not because she was uncertain of what the numbers said, but because she had learned something about certainty the hard way, and the lesson had come from a conversation in the spring of 1980 that she had not forgotten and was not going to forget. She had been writing to Dr. Polk for 6 months by then. She had been reading everything she could find about tropical breed adaptation and fescue toxicosis and heterosis effects in crossbreeding programs. She had been carrying the folder of letters and research data on the shelf above her desk for half a year. She had told no one about any of it, partly because there was nothing certain to tell yet, and partly because the plan had not fully solidified. Then one morning in April of 1980, she ran into Glenn Hadley at the grain elevator in Westmoreland. He asked how the operation was going. She said it was going all right. He asked whether she had been looking at any options for the fescue ground. She said she had been doing some reading. He asked what kind of reading. She told him, not everything, but enough. She mentioned the tropical breed research at Oklahoma State. She mentioned the fescue tolerance data. She mentioned that she had been corresponding with a professor there who thought the approach had real potential for operations like hers in the eastern Kansas grazing belt. Glenn Hadley listened politely. He let her finish. Then he said, well, what most folks do is either renovate the fescue or just accept the production loss and manage around it. That was all he said. He did not ask a follow-up question. He did not say the research she described sounded interesting. He said what most folks do, and then he moved on to a question about her hay storage, and the conversation ended the way conversations at grain elevators always end, with someone needing to pull their truck forward. Ruth drove home and thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. By evening, she had arrived at something that was not quite a decision, but was close to one. If the numbers she eventually produced were extraordinary, they would be attributed to error before they were attributed to skill. Not because of malice, because of expectation. A small operator with unusual results and a theory that ran against what most folks do would spend the first several years of any conversation defending the data rather than discussing it. She was not interested in spending years defending data. She was interested in producing data that could not be defended against. 3 years was what she decided. 3 consecutive years of numbers that went the same direction by the same margin. Not 1 October. 3 Octobers. Then she would have something she could set on a table and walk away from and let speak for itself. She went back to her correspondence with Dr. Polk and said nothing to Glenn Hadley or Walt Decker or anyone else in the county about what she was doing on the North Pasture or why. When Glenn stopped by on his annual haycheck visit that fall, she showed him what he asked to see and answered what he asked. She did not volunteer anything extra. When Walt Decker mentioned at the feed store that the Callaway place was still running some of those foreign cattle. Ruth heard about it secondhand through Roy Stanton and noted it in the same interior file where she kept things that were not worth responding to, but were worth remembering. By the spring of 1984, she had 3 complete years of data, and she moved the Thule cross animals onto the fescue pasture exclusively. This was the decision she had been working towards since she had read Colonel Ware's journal in the dead man's office in Junction City. The 60 acres on the north side of the property that had been a liability for every owner of that ground since the endophyte problem was first documented in the region had under the right genetics become something else entirely. She did not regrade the soil. She did not renovate the fescue. She did not spend $18,000 she did not have. She walked 5 cattle onto 60 acres and closed the gate. The summer of 1984 was the hottest stretch of years in that part of Kansas in a decade. July brought 3 consecutive days above 104 degrees, and then it stayed above 100 for another 10 days after that. The ponds on the lower ground dropped. The Hereford cows stood at the water, and in whatever shade the hedgerows cast, and lost condition, in a way that Ruth tracked in her notebook. With the same methodical consistency, she tracked everything else. The Thule Cross cows did not stand at the water. They moved through the fescue in the morning heat, and the midday heat, and the late afternoon heat, and they did not bunch, and they did not stop eating, and their calves did not stop nursing. And when Ruth weighed those calves in October, their numbers were what she had come to expect, which is to say they were numbers that belonged in a different category than the ones her Hereford calves were producing. Walt Decker drove past the North Pasture on Route 99 in August of that year, during the hottest week on a day when the temperature had been above 100 since 10 in the morning. He was coming back from the grain co-op. He slowed his truck when he came alongside Ruth's north fence because what he saw through the window did not immediately make sense to him. 5 head of cattle were grazing in full sun on the fescue ground at 2 in the afternoon. Their calves were beside them moving eating. Not a single animal was standing in the thin shade of the fence posts. Their coats were slick and their condition was visibly good, and Walt Decker sat on the shoulder of Route 99 for perhaps 30 seconds, looking at something his experience told him should not be happening the way it was happening. Then he drove on. He mentioned it at the feed store that Saturday. Said Ruth's got some kind of cattle on the fescue ground that do not seem to mind the heat. No one responded to it directly. Responding would have meant engaging with the idea that Ruth Callaway might be doing something right that Walt Decker and everyone else in the county had not thought of. That conversation had not arrived yet. The comment sat in the air for a moment and then dissolve the way such comments do when no one is ready to do anything with them. Ruth heard about it through Roy Stanton, who mentioned it without particular emphasis while they were both looking at a fence line on the property border in September. Roy said Walt had made some comment at the store about her fescue cattle. Ruth said she had heard that. Roy nodded. They looked at the fence for a while. Then they went back to what they had been doing. In the spring of 1985, a man named Marcus Lind drove out to the Callaway place on a Thursday morning. He wore clean boots and a pressed shirt, and had the vocabulary of someone who sold food to people who cared about the story behind it. He had gotten Ruth's name from Dr. Polk, who had mentioned her operation in a presentation at a Livestock Association meeting the previous winter. Not with fanfare, but as a data point in a larger discussion about alternative genetics for stress environments. Marcus Lind had written the name down. He was sourcing grass-finished beef for a restaurant group in Kansas City that had recently opened its third location and was marketing what they called heritage method beef, which meant cattle that had never seen a feedlot finished on grass with a documented background that a menu could reference without embarrassment. He walked her pastures for an hour. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the fescue ground. He asked to see her records. She brought out the notebook. He read it slowly, turning pages with the care of someone who understood what they were looking at. He asked intelligent questions about weaning weights and conception rates, and finish time on grass. He did not ask whether her husband was around. He offered 82 cents per pound live weight on 4 grass-finished steers. Ruth said 85. They settled at 83. The 4 steers averaged 1,040 pounds. The check that arrived 2 weeks later was for an amount that Ruth wrote in her notebook and then sat looking at for a long time. She compared it to the commodity price at the Westmoreland sale barn for equivalent animals. The difference was significant enough that she ran the calculation 3 times. Then she ran a projection forward 5 years, a gradual transition of the herd toward Thule Cross genetics. The fescue ground fully utilized the production numbers she had been tracking applied to a full 28 cow operation. She sat at the kitchen table where Earl had sat across from her every morning for 22 years and looked at what the numbers said. She had been running those numbers in her head for 4 years. Seeing them confirmed on paper in ink in that kitchen was a different thing. She closed the notebook. She got up and went to check cattle. She put the check in the bank the following Monday and said nothing about it to anyone. Marcus Lind came back in the fall. He came back every year after that. The third-generation calves were on the ground by 1985 and performing in ways that continued to exceed what Ruth's projections had anticipated. The fescue ground was producing at a rate that the county had never seen from that pasture under any management, not because the grass had changed, but because what was standing on it had changed. Ruth was tracking a metric she had invented herself, which she called forage days per pound. Of gain, a rough calculation of how many days on grass it took each animal to add a pound of body weight. The Thule Cross animals were consistently 15 to 22% more efficient than the straight Herefords on clean bluestem. On the fescue ground, the difference was even larger because the Hereford animals lost condition on fescue from mid-July forward, while the Thule Crosses did not lose condition at all. The ground had not changed. The forage had not changed. The management had not changed. What stood on it had changed, and the numbers in Ruth's notebook said so clearly and consistently, year after year in the same penciled handwriting, in the same spiral notebooks, that she had been keeping since before Earl died. She had 5 of them now, filled front to back. Then the winter of 1986 came. It came hard, and it came early. November brought 2 weeks of below normal temperatures and an ice storm that coated everything on the property in a 1/4 inch of clear ice that broke tree limbs and made the pasture paths dangerous. December was worse. January was the kind of month that tests equipment and animals and the patience of the people responsible for both. Ruth was checking twice a day and keeping close records on body condition, and she thought everything was holding when, in the third week of January, she went out to the fescue pasture in the morning and found one of the second-generation Tule Cross heifers down. The heifer was 2 years old. She had been born on the property out of the original Lot 87 cow sired by Ruth's Hereford bull. She had been one of the better animals in the herd by every metric Ruth tracked. She had settled on first service the previous spring. She was carrying a calf she would have delivered in late February. Ruth spent an hour with her. There was nothing to be done. Whatever had happened quickly. By afternoon, the heifer was gone. Ruth called the veterinarian in Westmoreland, a man named Dr. Clifford Branch, who had been the large animal vet for most of the county for 20 years. He came out the following morning and walked the pasture and looked at the animal and gave Ruth his assessment, which was that he could not determine a definitive cause without a full necropsy, and that in his experience winter losses in young cows could come from a range of causes. Some genetic, some environmental, some simply unexplained. He charged her for the farm call and drove back to town. Walt Decker heard about it by the end of the week. Ruth did not know how. She had told no one. But in a county the size of Pottawatomie, information about your neighbors moved without requiring anyone to carry it deliberately. By Saturday, the information had passed through the feed store, and Walt had made a comment that Roy Stanton heard and passed along to Ruth without editorializing. Walt had said something to the effect that this was the kind of thing you risked when you ran cattle that were not suited to Kansas winters, and that there was a reason nobody else in the county was doing what Ruth Calloway was doing. Ruth heard this on a Sunday morning. She did not respond to it. She went about her day the way she always did, which was to do what needed doing and leave the rest alone. But that Sunday night, after the evening feeding, she went back to the barn and sat down on a bale of hay with her 5 spiral notebooks stacked on the bale beside her, and the lantern burning and the temperature outside somewhere in the single digits. And she allowed herself for the first time since she had bought Lot 87 4 years earlier to seriously consider the possibility that she was wrong. Not wrong about the data. The data was what it was, but perhaps wrong about what the data meant. Perhaps the performance she had been recording was specific to these particular animals on this particular ground, in ways that would not hold across a larger herd or a longer time frame. Perhaps Walt Decker and Glenn Hadley and the collective consensus of Pottawatomie County had been looking at something she had been too determined to see clearly. Perhaps a heifer dead in January was the beginning of a pattern and not an isolated event. She sat with this for a long time. The lantern made the shadows move on the walls of the barn. Outside, the wind was working at the corners of the building the way it always worked in January, persistent and indifferent. She picked up the Colonel's journal from the stack of materials she had carried out of the house. She had been carrying it back and forth between the house and the barn for 4 years as a reference. She opened it to the section she knew best, the pages that covered the Tule Cross performance data from the Colonel's years in Botswana and his early years back in Kansas. She read through the notes she had read a dozen times before, and then she turned to a section she had not read as carefully a section toward the back of the 1975 entries, because when she had first read the journal in Junction City, she had been focused on the production data and the performance records and had not spent as much time on the observational passages the Colonel had written in a more conversational style. She read slowly now. The Colonel wrote about something he called the transition loss, a term he used to describe a pattern he had observed across multiple crossbreeding programs in multiple environments. When tropical or subtropical genetics were crossed with temperate British breeds, and the offspring were kept in conditions significantly different from the breeds of origin the first and second generation animals sometimes showed what the colonel called an immune adjustment period in their first or second winter. Not all of them. He estimated roughly one animal in every 12 to 15. The animals affected were not weaker genetically. They were animals whose immune systems were navigating a physiological territory that neither parent breed had fully mapped. Most of them made it through. A percentage did not. The colonel had documented this pattern across 3 separate crossbreeding programs over 15 years. He considered it a predictable cost of the first-generation transition, not a flaw in the genetics, not a reason to abandon the program, but a reality that anyone working with tropical cross animals in cold climates needed to anticipate and account for. He wrote that operators who abandoned their programs after a first or second generation loss were making the same mistake as a farmer who pulls a crop after the first hard rain. The genetics did not fail. The operator failed to understand what the genetics required. Ruth read this passage twice. Then she sat in the barn for a while without reading anything. The lantern burned. The wind worked at the corners of the building. She thought about the heifer that had died that morning, and about the calf she had been carrying, and about the 4 years of data in the 5 notebooks stacked on the hay bale beside her. She thought about what the colonel had written, and about the fact that he had spent 20 years watching this pattern in 4 countries before he wrote it down, and that he had written it down clearly, and specifically, and in language that left no room for a different interpretation. One animal in 12 to 15. She had lost one. The pattern the colonel described said it was a transition cost, not a failure of the genetics. She put the journal down on top of the notebooks. She sat for another few minutes. Then she picked up the lantern and went back to the house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, going through the data again from the beginning. Not because she needed to check the numbers, but because she needed to feel their weight. All 4 years of them, all the mornings, she had stood at the fence and the scale and the pasture gate and the grain elevator and not said anything to anyone, while the evidence built itself page by page in her barn coat pocket. When she finally went to bed, it was past 2 in the morning. She set her alarm for 5, which was when she always set it. She lay in the dark for a while and thought about Earl, which she did most nights before she fell asleep. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the particular quiet of someone who has learned to carry an absence as a permanent feature of the landscape, rather than an interruption of it. She thought about the way he used to sit at this same table with his own notebook, tallying numbers she had not yet learned to read, patient and methodical and never in a hurry about anything important. She thought about how he had taught her that the most dangerous moment in any agricultural operation was not a bad season, or a sick animal, or a falling market. The most dangerous moment was when you let someone else's certainty replace your own data. The data was what it was. Everything else was opinion. She fell asleep holding that thought. By February, she had moved past it. The remaining Thule cross animals came through the rest of the winter without incident. The second-generation bull calf that had been born the previous spring was doing exactly what Ruth's projections said he should be doing. The fescue pasture was carrying 5 animals through a Kansas winter on less supplemental hay than she fed the Herefords on clean bluestem. Walt Decker did not mention anything further at the feed store. At least not anything that made its way back to Ruth through Roy Stanton. She wrote to Dr. Polk in March and told him what had happened. She described the loss, the numbers around it, what she had found in the colonel's journal. His letter back was 3 pages. He confirmed what the colonel had written. He had documented the same pattern in his own trials at a slightly lower incidence rate. He said her response to the loss, which was to go back to the data and the records, rather than to the consensus of the county, was exactly the right response. He said the data she had been accumulating was, by that point, among the most consistent and well-documented practical crossbreeding records he had access to outside of a university setting. He said he wanted to come and see the operation in person if she was willing to have him. She wrote back and said she was. He came in the spring of 1987. He was a tall, thin man with glasses and a handshake that was firmer than his appearance suggested. He drove up from Stillwater in a university truck with Oklahoma State plates and parked in the driveway and stood looking at the north pasture for a moment before he said anything. When he finally spoke, it was not a greeting. He said, "You have them on the fescue." It was not a question. She said, "Since '84. He nodded. They spent 2 days on the property. He took soil samples from the fescue pasture and compared them with samples from the bluestem ground. He weighed and measured every Thule cross animal on the property. He photographed the herd and the pastures and the drainage patterns and the hay barn and the fence lines and the spiral notebooks, of which there were now 6, covering 6 years of daily records in Ruth's careful penciled handwriting. On the second afternoon, they stood at the fence of the north pasture, with the sun going down behind them, and the cattle moving through the fescue, in the kind of light that makes even ordinary ground look like something worth staying for. He told her that what she had built on this 160 acres was one of the 3 most significant small herd crossbreeding demonstrations he had documented in 20 years of research. She said, "Thank you." He stayed for supper. They sat at the kitchen table until past dark, talking about cattle genetics, the first conversation of that length she had had with anyone about her work since Earl died. Dr. Polk talked the way she liked people to talk, which was precisely and without pretending to, more certainty than the evidence warranted. He talked about what the data showed and what it suggested, and what it could not yet prove. He talked about the paper he wanted to write. He said he would need her records as the primary data set. He said her name would appear in the paper as the source of the field data. Ruth put her coffee cup down. She sat with that for a moment. She said, when would it publish? He said it would take a year at least, maybe 2 to clear peer review. Probably 1989 or 1990 if everything moved well. She nodded. She refilled his coffee. They talked until 9, which was later than Ruth typically stayed up on a work night. And then she showed him to the spare room and went to bed, and lay in the dark with the quiet the house always had after a visitor arrived, and the particular quality it had before one left. The paper did not come out in 1989. It came out in 1990, and then it was revised and resubmitted. And then it came out again in a different form. In 1991, and the version that Ruth eventually held in her hands was dated 1993, and bore her name in the acknowledgments and in the data citations, and once in the body of the text itself, where Dr. Polk described the Callaway operation as the most sustained and methodologically rigorous informal crossbreeding trial documented in the literature. Ruth had not known that last sentence was in the paper until she read it sitting at the kitchen table on the morning the journal arrived in her mailbox. She read it once. She read it again. Outside the kitchen window, the fescue pasture was beginning to show green at the base, the way it did every spring, the grass coming back through the dead thatch, the same way it had come back every year since she had been managing it. Indifferent to opinion, indifferent to the feed store consensus, doing what it had always done on this ground. The cattle were moving through the early morning light. Their calves were beside them. The whole north pasture looked the way it had looked every spring for 12 years, which was to say it looked like a problem that turned out not to be a problem, or rather like a problem that turned out to be something else entirely, once you put the right animal on it and waited long enough to see what happened. She folded the journal to page 41 and put it on the kitchen counter. She wrote the date in her current notebook. She wrote paper published Journal of Animal Science, Volume 91. She wrote the page number. She made a small check mark next to the entry, the same check mark she used to mark things that had gone according to plan. Then she put on her barn coat and went out to feed cattle because the cattle did not care what year a paper was published, and the water tanks needed checking, and the morning was already past 5:30, which was later than she usually started. What she did not know yet, not on that morning, was that the journal had already been in other hands before it arrived in her mailbox. Harlan Decker had subscribed to the Journal of Animal Science through K-State the previous year because Harlan had graduated with an animal science degree and was beginning to take over the management of his father's registered Angus operation, and had the habit of someone trying to stay current in a field that was moving faster than the county consensus acknowledged. He had read the paper the day his copy arrived. He had read it sitting at his desk in the office of the Decker Ranch, which was 12 miles north of Route 99. And he had read it carefully, the way a young man reads something that rearranges what he thought he knew. Then he had folded it open to page 41 and carried it into the living room where his father was sitting after supper, with a cup of coffee and the evening news on low. He had set the journal on the arm of his father's chair without saying much, just setting it there and walking out of the room. Walt Decker had read the page once. Then he had read it again. He had sat in his chair for a long time after that, looking at the wall, thinking about a comment he had made at the feed store in the fall of 1981, and about the way that comment had gone around the room and been picked up and passed along, without anyone pushing back on it, including himself, and about what it meant that he had said what he said, with the confidence of a man who had spent his whole life in cattle and had been wrong about something for 12 years without knowing it. He had sat in that chair for a long time. Then he had gone to bed. In the morning, he had driven to Ruth Calloway's place on Route 99 and pulled onto the gravel shoulder outside her gate and sat in the cab with the engine idling for a moment, not because he did not know what he was going to say, but because saying it was going to cost him something, and he was letting himself feel the cost before he got out of the truck. The journal was on the seat beside him. He did not need to look at it again. Walt Decker got out of the truck slowly, the way a man gets out of a truck when his knees have been doing this for 60 years, and his body has its own opinion about how fast things should happen. He closed the door behind him. He stood at the gate for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets and looked up the gravel drive toward the barn, where the sound of a welding torch was carrying across the still morning air in short, controlled bursts. He opened the gate and walked up the drive. The gravel was firm under his boots. The north pasture was on his left, and he could see the cattle moving through the spring grass without looking directly at them. The way you see things at the edge of your vision that you already know are there. Ruth was at the workbench inside the open barn door with her back to the drive, a welding hood pushed up on her forehead, and a piece of angle iron clamped in the vise, and a section of hay feeder frame laid out on the bench that she was fitting the new piece to. She heard him on the gravel and turned around. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, which was directly without hurrying to any conclusion. Walt stopped a few feet inside the barn door. He stood with his hands still in his coat pockets. He was a big man, had been bigger once, and the years had not reduced him so much as settled him the way a well-built structure settles over time without losing its essential shape. He looked at Ruth for a moment. Then he said what he had driven 12 miles to say. He told her he owed her an apology. He said he had made a comment at the feed store when she bought that cow back in the spring of 1981, and that the comment had gone around, and he had not stopped it, and he had not walked it back, and he had been wrong. He said he had been in cattle his whole life, and he should have looked at what she was doing instead of what he assumed she was doing. Ruth set down her pliers. She pushed the welding hood the rest of the way up and off and set it on the bench. She looked at Walt Decker with the same expression she had offered the cow at the fence in Junction City 12 years earlier, which was the expression of someone measuring the true weight of a thing before deciding what to do with it. She let a moment pass. Then she said he was not the only one. He said he knew that, but he said it anyway. Said it was his comment that started it, and he should have known better. And he did not have a good reason for why he had not. They walked out to the fence of the north pasture. It was the last week of March, and the fescue was coming up green from the base, the way it came up every year. And the Thule cross cows were moving through the morning grass with their calves beside them, unhurried and steady in the way of animals that have never been asked to be anything other than what they are. Walt stood at the fence and looked at what Ruth had built on 60 acres that the entire county had written off as unworkable ground. And he did not say anything for a moment. He just looked. Then he started asking questions. Real questions, the kind that cost something to ask, because each one was a quiet admission that he had not asked it when it would have mattered most. He asked about the fescue tolerance mechanism, how it worked in physiological terms, what the end-of-fight toxin did, and why these animals did not respond to it the way his Angus did. He asked about the calving ease data, whether the moderate frame translated to easier unassisted births. He asked about finish time on grass versus grain, and whether the restaurant buyers he had heard about were paying a consistent premium, or whether the market was still forming. Ruth answered all of it. She answered the way she answered everyone who asked genuinely, which was completely and specifically and without holding anything back, because information withheld from someone who was ready to use it well was just waste, and she had no patience for waste. She told him about the forage efficiency numbers she had been tracking. She told him about the fescue pasture performance across 9 years. She told him about Marcus Lind and the Kansas City buyers, and the premium per pound, and what the numbers looked like projected across a larger operation than hers. They stood at that fence for an hour. The sun climbed and the cattle moved, and the conversation went the way good conversations about cattle always go, which is slowly at first and then faster, as the shared language takes over, and the distance between two people who have spent their lives reading the same ground begins to close. Walt listened more than he talked, which Ruth noted without commenting on it. When a man who has spent his life being the authority in the room chooses to listen, it means something different than when a younger man does it. It means he has already done the harder work. Before he left, Walt told her that he and Harlan were going to look seriously at introducing Thule cross genetics on the fescue ground on the south half of the Decker operation. He said Harlan had already been thinking along those lines before the paper came out, which was the first mention he had made of Harlan and the journal, and he said it in a way that made it clear he was giving his son credit for arriving at the conclusion before his father did, which was its own kind of admission from a man like Walt Decker. Ruth said she would be glad to share whatever records he wanted to look at. She said Dr. Polk at Oklahoma State was the right person to talk to about sourcing genetics, and that she would write a letter of introduction if that would help. Walt said that would be appreciated. He shook her hand at the gate. He drove back down Route 99 with his windows down in the March morning air, and the fescue pasture visible in his rearview mirror for about a quarter mile before the road curved and it disappeared. 3 weeks after the paper came out, Ruth received the first inquiry from a neighboring operation about purchasing Thule cross heifers. The call came from a rancher named Ed Pruitt, who ran 220 head 12 miles east of Westmoreland and had been managing fescue pastures on the creek bottoms of his property with the same resigned frustration that most operators in the eastern Kansas belt managed them. Ed had read the paper. He had questions. Ruth answered them. By the end of April, she had received 2 more calls from operations in the county. By fall, she had sold 2 heifers at $800 each, which was 4 times what she had paid for the cow they descended from. She sold 4 more in 1994, By 1995, there were Thule cross animals on 5 operations in Pottawatomie County, every one of them traceable back to Lot 87. The 900-pound cow with the forward-curving horns that the auctioneer at Westmoreland had run third from last on a Saturday morning in March of 1981, because he did not know where else to put her. Marcus Lind came back every fall, as he had come back every fall since 1985. The restaurant group he sourced for had grown from 3 locations to 7, and the demand for grass-finished beef with a documented background had grown with it. He had brought buyers from Denver the previous year. That spring he called to say he had a contact in Chicago who was interested in a long-term supply arrangement. Ruth took the call at the kitchen table and wrote the details in her current notebook and said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days, the way she thought about everything that involved changing the shape of what she was doing. Then she called Marcus back and said she was interested in the arrangement, but that she needed him to understand something first. She told him she ran 35 head on 160 acres. She told him that was the number the ground told her was right, and that she was not going to push beyond it to meet a supply target that belonged to someone else's growth plan. She said if that worked for the Chicago buyer, it worked for her. If it did not, she understood. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was the most sensible thing any producer he worked with had said to him in 10 years. He said they would make it work. He kept his word. The arrangement held. Ruth never grew the operation beyond what the land could carry. 35 head on 160 acres. The number the ground told her was right. She said no to the Cattlemen's Association speaking invitation that arrived in 1994, and again when it arrived in 1995. She said no to the Breed magazine interview request. She continued to write to Dr. Polk letters that had started as technical correspondence and had become over 14 years of back and forth, something closer to a friendship conducted entirely on paper. The kind of friendship that forms between people who share a way of thinking rather than a geography. Glenn Hadley retired from the county extension office in the spring of 1994. He had been the extension agent for Pottawatomie County for 23 years. At the retirement party in the fellowship hall of the First Methodist Church in Westmoreland, people said the things they say at such events which were true and kind, and covered most of the ground that needed covering without going near the parts that would have required more honesty than a fellowship hall allows. Ruth was not at the party. She had not been invited and would not have attended if she had been. Glenn came to see her in June of that year, 6 weeks after his retirement. He drove out on a Tuesday morning and parked in the driveway and walked up to the house. Ruth was on the porch with her coffee when he pulled in. She watched him get out of the car and walk across the yard and step up onto the porch. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing what he wanted to say and was no longer sure the rehearsal had prepared him adequately. He said congratulations on the paper. He said he had read it when it came out, and he thought she had done something important, something that would change the way people in this part of the state thought about fescue ground and alternative genetics for a long time. Ruth put her coffee cup down on the porch railing. She went inside the house. Glenn stood on the porch and heard her moving around inside and did not know what was happening. She came back out a minute later with a white envelope in her hand. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. He turned it over. He saw his own signature on the back, the stamp, and the forwarding notation. The words not within the scope of current priorities in his own handwriting from 15 years earlier. He stood on the porch holding the envelope that Colonel James Ware had written in October of 1979, and that Glenn Hadley had returned with a 3-sentence rejection, and that Ruth had carried in her barn coat pocket from a dead man's office in Junction City, and kept for 13 years without saying a word about it to anyone. He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the envelope. He looked at his own signature. He thought about Colonel Ware, who had spent 20 years accumulating the knowledge that was in that envelope and who had offered it to the county for free and been told it was not relevant, and who had died in his kitchen in January of 1981 without ever knowing whether anyone would use what he knew. Ruth did not say anything either. She picked up her coffee cup and waited. Glenn finally said that he had made a mistake. He said it plainly, without softening it or qualifying it. He said he had seen what he expected to see and had not looked past it. And that was the job he had been hired to do, and he had not done it. Ruth said that was true. She said it in the same tone she would have used to confirm a weaning weight, factual, and without cruelty because it was a fact, and there was nothing to be gained by making it larger or smaller than it was. She said he was not the only one who had made that mistake in this county, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she said Colonel Ware deserved better than what he got, and that the letter was the evidence of it, and she wanted Glenn to have it so he would not forget that the evidence existed. Glenn held the envelope for a moment longer. Then he put it in the pocket of his jacket. He said he would not forget. He walked back to his car. He drove away down Route 99, and Ruth stood on the porch and watched him go, and then finished her coffee and went to move cattle. She did not think about the envelope again that day. She had held onto it for 13 years, not because she was waiting for the right moment to use it against Glenn Hadley, but because it was the true record of what had happened, and she believed in keeping true records. What he did with it now was his business. She had done what needed doing. The years moved the way years move on a working ranch, which is to say they moved in the rhythms of the season, and the cattle and the grass and the machinery and the accumulation of them was only visible when you looked back from a distance. By 1995, Ruth had completed the transition she had been working towards since 1981. The last of the straight Hereford cows went to the Westmoreland sale barn in October of that year, 14 years after she had stood in that same yard and raised her hand for $200 while the men at the rail turned around to see who it was. She loaded them herself and drove them over in Roy Stanton's trailer, which Roy continued to lend without commentary or condition. And she collected the check and drove home and wrote the amount in her notebook next to the date. She had begun with a problem she could not afford to solve. She had ended with a solution. The problem had paid for itself. Dr. Polk came back once more in the fall of 1997, 4 years after the paper, and 2 years before his retirement. He was thinner than he had been on his first visit, and moved a little more carefully. But the precision of his thinking had not changed, and neither had his handshake. They walked the pastures the way they had walked them 10 years earlier, with the difference that this time there was nothing to prove and nothing to demonstrate, and they were simply two people who had been corresponding for 18 years, looking at the result of what that correspondence had been about. He stood at the fence of the north pasture on the second afternoon and looked at the cattle in the fescue and said that in 40 years of research, he had documented exactly 3 operations where a single producer had solved a systemic regional problem through independent field research without institutional support, and that hers was one of them. He said it the way he said things, which was precisely with the weight of what he meant fully behind the words and nothing extra added. Ruth said, "Raymond, that is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in 20 years. He laughed. He was not a man who laughed often, and when he did, it was the laugh of someone surprised into it, which made it worth more than the usual kind. They sat on the porch until dark and talked about cattle, and about what was happening in the research literature, and about a young professor at K-State who was doing interesting work on warm-season grass mixes that Ruth had been following. He left the next morning before breakfast. She stood in the driveway and watched his university truck go down the gravel to Route 99 and turn south, and she stood there for a moment after the truck had disappeared. The way you stand when someone leaves who you are not certain you will see again in the particular way you have known them. His retirement dinner was in Stillwater in 2001. She did not attend. She sent a letter. He read it at the dinner in a room full of colleagues and former students and a cake that said, 40 years of better beef. And after he had read it, he put it back in his breast pocket and gave a short speech in which he mentioned 3 operations that had shaped his understanding of practical cattle genetics more than any controlled university trial. He said Ruth Calloway's name clearly so the room could hear it. He said what she had done, and he said it mattered. Every letter she had ever written him, 47 of them over 22 years, was in a file folder in his office that he had labeled with her name and her county, and the year the correspondence began. When he retired, he donated the entire correspondence to the University Library Archive. A graduate student used the letters as the primary source for a master's thesis in 2006. The thesis cited Ruth 31 times. Ruth did not know about the thesis until Dr. Polk mentioned it in a letter in 2007. One of the last long letters he wrote before his health made writing difficult. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a November evening, with the wind working at the windows the way it always worked in November, and made a note of it in her current notebook. Then she wrote back and asked him how he was feeling. His answer took 3 months to arrive and was shorter than his letters usually were, but the handwriting was the same. Lily Calloway came for the first summer in 2002. She was 14 years old, the daughter of Ruth's son, Michael, who lived in Topeka and worked in insurance and came out to the property twice a year with his family for the holidays. Visits that Ruth enjoyed, and that ended the way such visits always ended, with people who belonged to different rhythms of life amicably and with a relief on both sides. That was never spoken. Lily was different. Lily arrived in June with a duffel bag and a pair of boots that were slightly too large, and the particular alertness of a young person who has been waiting for a place that fits them without knowing that was what they were waiting for. She learned fast. Not the showy fast of someone performing competence, but the quiet, incremental fast of someone who retains what they observe and applies it carefully the next time. Ruth had seen that quality once before in a person which was in Earl, who had learned everything he knew in that same way, slowly and permanently. She did not say this to Lily. She just kept showing her what needed showing and let the girl do what she was capable of doing at whatever pace she was capable of doing it. By the second summer, Lily was checking water lines on her own and keeping accurate records of what she found, and doing the daily weigh-ins on the heifer calves with the portable scale without being asked. By the third summer, she was reading body condition scores on the cows with an accuracy that Ruth checked against her own assessments and found consistently within half a point. The girl was going to be good at this. Not good in the way of someone who has taken the right classes or read the right books, but good in the bone-deep way of someone who belongs to this kind of work. On a morning in that third summer of 2004, Lily was in the equipment shed, watching Ruth do the monthly start on the Ford 3000. The Ford was 38 years old that summer. Earl had bought it new in 1966. Ruth had serviced it every spring since his death, changed the oil, checked the fluid levels, greased the fittings, and turned it over on the first of every month the way Earl had done, not because it needed to run, but because that was what you did with a machine that had served you right and that deserved to be kept ready. She had replaced the hydraulic pump that same year and bought a used Kubota for the heavy haying work. But the Ford stayed. Lily watched Ruth finish the pre-start checks. Then she asked why. She asked it the way a young person who has earned some ground asks a question which is directly and without apology. Ruth climbed down from the step and stood for a moment with her hand on the fender. She thought about the question. She said that Earl had bought this tractor new. She said he had taken care of it the way he took care of everything he was responsible for, which was carefully and consistently and without cutting corners. She said it was her job to make sure it was still here when someone needed to remember what it sounded like. Lily thought about this. She asked if she could start it. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she took the key out of her jacket pocket and held it out. Lily took the key and climbed up onto the seat. The seat was sprung and low, and her feet did not reach the pedals. She found the ignition and slid the key in and looked at the controls and did not rush. She set the throttle the way she had watched Ruth set it. She turned the key. The engine turned once without catching. She waited the way Ruth had shown her to wait. She turned it again. The Ford 3000 caught on the second try, and the engine filled the shed with a sound that had been filling that same shed since 1966. A deep, slightly uneven idle that smoothed out after 30 seconds the way it always did. The sound of a machine that knew its own rhythms and settled into them without being told. Lily sat in the seat with both hands on the wheel and her feet hanging above the pedals, and did not say anything for a long time. The engine ran. The shed smelled of oil and dust and old metal, and the particular smell of machinery that has been maintained across many years by someone who took the maintenance seriously. Ruth stood at the open door of the shed with her arms crossed and watched her granddaughter sit in the seat that Earl had sat in and listen to the sound that Earl had listened to. And she did not say anything either. There was nothing to add. The sound said what needed saying. After a while, Lily reached down and shut the engine off. She sat for another moment in the quiet. Then she climbed down and handed Ruth the key without speaking. Ruth put the key in her pocket. They walked out of the shed into the morning light and went to feed cattle. The summer of 2004 was dry. The driest June in the county since 1988. Ruth was managing water, carefully moving the cattle on a tighter rotation than usual, watching the grass for stress signs, making adjustments she had made in dry years before and would make again. She was not worried. She had seen dry years and wet years and years when the market dropped out from under you, and years when everything lined up and the numbers made sense, and she had learned to manage against the range of all of them, rather than planning for any one version of the year. Later that July, she was doing maintenance on the Ford. She was not using it for anything heavy that season, just the monthly start and an occasional light job, but she kept up the maintenance schedule regardless of usage. She was replacing the hydraulic fluid and had the access panel off the side of the tractor and was checking the lines when she noticed that the tray under the panel was sitting slightly off its mounting, as though something behind it had shifted over the years to lift one corner by a fraction of an inch. She had never looked behind the tray. She reached in and found a piece of metal catching on the back edge. She pulled the tray out fully. Behind it, in the space between the tray mount and the tractor frame, was a folded piece of paper. It was folded twice the way you fold something to fit a pocket, and it had been there long enough that the fold lines had become structural. The paper stiff and slightly yellowed at the edges. Ruth pulled it out carefully. She unfolded it on the workbench. It was a page torn from a magazine. The paper was the weight of magazine stock. The printing was the 2-column format she recognized from agricultural publications of that era. The top of the page had a partial headline in bold type about breed adaptation in Southern Plains grazing systems. And below the headline was an article that she did not need to read the first paragraph of to recognize. She already knew this article. She had read it herself in the fall of 1979. She had read it 3 times with a pencil in her hand. She had torn it out of her own copy and kept it in the kitchen drawer for 2 years before she threw it away because she had memorized everything in it. This was not her copy. She looked at the date printed at the top of the page. The issue date was August of 1976. She stood at the workbench for a long time, holding the page in both hands. August of 1976 was 3 months before Earl had died in the truck on a Tuesday afternoon in November. with fencing pliers in his pocket. He had been reading this article 3 months before he died. He had torn it out of the magazine and folded it twice and put it behind the tray panel. In the Ford 3000, the same Ford he had bought new 10 years earlier, and maintained with the same careful consistency she had maintained it with after he was gone. And he had put it there the way a person puts something in a safe place, not because they are done with it, but because they intend to come back to it. He had not come back to it. She stood at the workbench in the equipment shed on a dry July morning in 2004 and held Earl Calloway's copy of the article she had read in 1979 and that she had written to Oklahoma State about, and that had started 22 years of notebooks and letters and fescue pasture data and a paper in a peer-reviewed journal and 47 letters in a university archive and 5 operations in the county running cattle that no one had wanted, and buyers coming from Kansas City and Denver and Chicago to a gate on Route 99. Earl had seen it. He had been thinking about it. He had torn it out of the magazine and put it somewhere he would not lose it, and intended to do something with it. And then he had died on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months later with fencing pliers in his pocket, and the thought unfinished. And Ruth had bought the same tractor from his estate and serviced it every spring for 27 years, and started it on the first of every month, and never once looked behind the tray panel. She had spent 22 years carrying out a plan that Earl had been 3 months from starting, not because she knew it was his plan, not because anyone had told her, but because they had been looking at the same ground with the same eyes for 22 years of marriage, and they had arrived at the same answer independently. And he had died before he could act on it, and she had lived long enough to do what he had seen needed doing. She stood at the workbench for a long time. The shed was quiet around her. Outside the door, the dry Kansas summer was doing what it did, burning off the moisture and pulling color from the grass, and asking everything on the land to prove it had the right to be there. She could hear the cattle somewhere in the fescue pasture on the other side of the barn, moving through what had once been the most troubled ground on the property, doing what they had been doing every summer for 20 years now, which was grazing steadily and without complaint, and turning poor pasture into weight, the way only the right animal on the right ground can do. She folded the page back along its original fold lines. She carried it into the house and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept important papers next to Earl's death certificate and the deed to the property, and the folder of letters from Dr. Polk, which was thick enough now that it barely closed. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her hand resting on the closed drawer. Then she went back out to finish the maintenance on the Ford. The original cow, the one that had come to this pasture as Lot 87 in March of 1981, died in October of 1996. She was 21 years old. In 15 years on the Calloway place, she had produced 14 calves, every one of them unassisted, every one of them healthy, every one of them carrying genetics that had moved outward through the county and beyond in the years since. Her last calf, a heifer, was born in the spring of 1995 and was grazing in the fescue pasture with the rest of the herd when her mother went down in October quietly in the corner of the pasture near the old wooden gate, with no visible distress and no drawn-out process the way an animal goes when it has lived well and used itself fully and has simply arrived at the end of what it was given. Ruth found her in the morning on her second check. She stood in the fescue for a while in the October light. The grass was still green at the base. The rest of the cattle were moving in the pasture behind her. The air smelled of fall and of turned earth where the hooves had worked up the grass along the fence line. She went back to the barn and got the Ford. She drove it out to the fescue pasture and worked for 2 hours in the dry October ground, the tractor doing what it had been doing on this property for 30 years, moving earth, making something possible that could not be done by hand alone. She dug the hole near the fence line on the Route 99 side of the pasture, where the cow had grazed on her first afternoon on the property 15 years earlier. Standing in the blue stem, with her head down, as though she had been doing it her whole life. She buried her there without ceremony. She did not mark the spot with a stone or a post or any kind of sign. She knew where it was. That was enough. She drove the Ford back to the barn and cleaned the blade and parked it in the shed and checked on the remaining cattle and went back to the house and made supper. The grass grew over the spot by spring. It grew the way grass grows over everything in time, which is completely and without reference to what lies underneath. The fescue came up green from the base the way it came up every spring, indifferent to the winter that had tried to stop it, and indifferent to the summer that would try to burn it back, and indifferent to the decades of certainty from the men at the auction yard and the feed store and the extension office that this ground was a liability and not an asset, and that the animals standing on it were the wrong kind of animals for a Kansas woman with 160 acres, and a problem she could not afford to solve. The grass grew. The cattle moved through it. The data continued to accumulate in the notebooks, which now filled an entire shelf above the desk, in the small room off the kitchen where Ruth kept her records. Lot 87 had no headstone, but for every producer in 3 counties who was running Tule Cross cattle on fescue ground for every calf weighed in October, that came in above the county average for every feed cost not spent on grass renovation, and every vet call not made for heat stress in August. The reckoning was ongoing. It did not require a marker. It did not require acknowledgement from the men who had laughed at the auction in 1981, or the extension office that had sent back a 3-sentence rejection to a man who only wanted to share what he knew. It only required the ground to keep responding to what stood on it. Some things do not become worthless just because the men at the auction say so. Some things only need someone patient enough to see what nobody else was looking for, and disciplined enough to keep looking after the first win or loss, and quiet enough to let the numbers build without asking anyone else to believe in them before they were ready to speak for themselves. Ruth Calloway had been all 3 of those things for 22 years. She had learned them from a man who taught her to read cattle before he taught her to drive a car, and who had died on a Tuesday afternoon in November with fencing pliers in his pocket and a magazine page folded behind the tray panel of a tractor he had bought new in 1966, and who had seen the same answer she had seen from the same ground that they had both spent their lives trying to understand. She had carried his answer forward without knowing it was his, and the ground had kept responding the way ground responds when it is given what it needs, rather than what is convenient, which is to say honestly and without sentiment. The same way Ruth Calloway had managed everything she was responsible for from the day Earl died in that truck on the back 40 until the last morning she walked the fescue pasture in the early light with her notebook in her barn coat pocket and the cattle moving through the grass and the whole north side of the property, doing what she had always believed it could do, which was everything.